As a developmental psychologist, I understand thriving as an adaptive growth process. So it's not linear, towards living out one's purpose, which is found in our individual uniqueness, our relationality and connection with others, and our living out our deepest aspirations.
Welcome to Purposeful Lab, a Maja Center podcast. I'm Katherine Hadro with my co-host, Dr. Dan Keebler. Dan, you set us up nicely in episode 1 this season, talking about the evolution of the human brain. Today, we're going to hear from a psychologist's perspective.
Yeah, we haven't had a psychologist on the program yet,
Right.
in particular when we're talking about human flourishing and human purpose and meaning. Psychology's got a lot to offer, and so we'll be looking at developmental psychology and evolutionary psychology and seeing how do those disciplines inform what we know about the human person and give some light on what it means to flourish.
And our guest today is Dr. Pam King. She's the Peter L. Benson Professor of Applied Developmental Science, so developmental psychologist, in the School of Psychology at the Fuller Theological Seminary. She's also executive director of the Thrive Center for Human Development, author of a number of books. We had a lot to talk about, a lot of shared mission, I think, too, when it comes to purpose.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap in terms of thriving and purpose in her work and what we're trying to do here.
Absolutely. So with that, here's our conversation with Dr. Pam King. Dr. Pam King, thank you so much for traveling all the way from California to join us. We've been so excited to have you on the podcast. So as we get things kicked off, can you just tell us what brought you to your work today, personally and professionally?
Yes, and first off, thank you so much for having me and your gracious hospitality. It's really wonderful and an honor to be here. Thanks. And so I am the executive director of the Thrive Center for Human Development that is at Fuller Theological Seminary, which is a multi-denominational Protestant seminary in Pasadena, California. And I'm on the faculty of the School of Psychology there as an applied developmental scientist. And my journey there was somewhat precarious, and especially in that these were not known fields of study of doing human thriving when I was born and trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life eventually. And so my life professionally has been one of a volley between psychology and theology, of really asking questions about what does it mean for humans to thrive. When I was first in seminary, a friend asked me, he said, "Pam, what pushes your buttons?" Like in a good way, not like,
Yeah.
like, your kids when they don't do their homework. No, but what pushes your buttons and makes you light up? And very spontaneously, I said, enabling people to become who God created them to be. And I heard myself say it, and I was like, yes, that's it. And so I had this sense of clarity about that call. And I was about 26, but then as I got deeper into my Master's of Divinity, I actually came away with more questions about how that occurs rather than more answers. And so then I started to turn to psychology because the Bible gives us lots of ideals and there's lots of claims about a fullness of life in Christ and how we are to live our lives to glorify God. But how people change and become that remained as questions. So then I started studying psychology more.
Yeah. So what do you see like the fruit of studying both psychology from the lens of theology and studying theology with the lens of psychology? How do they enrich each other?
Great question. And again, I got into this not knowing anything, but over time, what I've really seen is that disciplines like theology or philosophy speak to normative claims on our life. They offer what I like to refer to as a telos, like as a goal or a purpose for human life. And they make these ultimate claims that the sciences aren't necessarily so well versed to do. I find the sciences, and I'm more of a social scientist, knowing you're a natural scientist, as being more descriptive of describing what is. So often in psychology or sociology, we might describe conventional trends, what people say, what people think, not necessarily what should be.
Right. Okay.
So the theology provides a lens to go what should be, and psychology helps me understand how to get there.
Yeah.
You've mentioned you're the executive director of the Thrive Center for Human Development, and your work has contributed significantly to our understanding of what it means to thrive.
Mhm.
What is your definition of thriving truly? And what do you think are the major misconceptions about that?
A great question. So the word thrive, I have found, like, who doesn't want to thrive? Like, it sounds good. It rolls off the tongue nicely. In California, we have Kaiser Health. There's lots of Thrive billboards and bus signs. But what does it mean?
Yeah.
So for me, with much careful study, both psychologically, philosophically, and theologically, I've come to understand thriving as living life on purpose. And to unpack that a bit, as a developmental psychologist, I understand thriving as an adaptive growth process. So it's not linear, but it's an adaptive growth process towards living out one's purpose, which is found in our individual uniqueness, our relationality and connection with others, and our living out our deepest aspirations.
Yeah. And determining what purpose is and for thriving,
Yeah.
I mean, that requires some understanding of what it is, what is a human person, what are we meant for, right?
Exactly.
And how does psychology help with that? Because it doesn't necessarily, tell you the goal of human life, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. It does not. So psychology, it's interesting, developmental psychology, actually, there are some great tools because from a developmental perspective, we want to see systems continue and individuals continue. So we want to have an ongoing thriving trajectory, which calls to mind that we need to understand how individuals differentiate and grow into their strengths, address their needs, but they also have to live relationally. And so much of the normative Western developmental psychology is about individual development and actually doesn't emphasize the importance of relational development, how we cultivate intimacy, how generosity, compassion, these virtues that sustain relational life, and that ethical sense that keeps, in a very dynamic way, the individual and system a good fit. Like with our climate crisis right now, humans have disregarded the needs of the environment. That's not obviously sustainable. So we need these correctives.
Yeah. Well, you have the reciprocating self from the book that you wrote. So that is, looking at how humans interact with other people to bring out human flourishing. Is that?
Yeah. So the notion of the reciprocating self started as when I started teaching developmental psychology in a Christian context. We're on a quarter system, so 10 weeks to do the lifespan.
Okay.
Cradle to the grave or womb to the tomb.
Wow.
And I thought, of all the theories and research out there, what is the best to teach? And then I thought in the context of a faith-based seminary, what is God's perspective on human development? And first, with a huge grain of humility, knowing I won't ultimately know. but that's when I did actually turn back to my theology and ask, so what is it made to be made in the image of God? And understanding that from kind of a Trinitarian and Christological, theological anthropology, wanting to understand how people become like Christ and conform to the image of God in Christ, and then how they also might be made in the image of the Trinity as unique persons that live in unity. So that started to become a filter for how I understood positive developmental psychology.
And I think it's worth mentioning you're an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church.
Yes.
And, that lens really comes through and contributes greatly to your work. We mentioned your book, The Reciprocating Self. You're author of several books, including you co-wrote a book called Thriving with Stone Age Minds, Evolutionary Psychology, Christian Faith, and the Quest for Human Flourishing. We've talked some about developmental psychology. What is evolutionary psychology?
So evolutionary psychology is a discipline or the study of human behavior and cognition through the lens of biological evolution, which looks at how humans might be born with certain dispositions. We have biological traits, but do we have biology that might impact how we think, act, and feel? And so from an evolutionary perspective, we know our brains were wired to help us survive. So fight or flight, if there's an attacker, we run. And over time, though, our needs, our evolutionary niche, our environments have changed. And so our thinking and our psychological habits have evolved over time.
Yeah, one of the things we've talked about previously on the show is that the human development, right, seems to be different, more extended than other primates and other hominids, and it's also more relational in the sense we come out wired for relationality, right?
Absolutely.
And that's part of sort of our evolutionary psychology. If we don't do that, we don't flourish in a sense. So what do you see in terms of what that tells us about human life, human flourishing, and so forth?
Yes. So like we not only take this like theological ideal of becoming reciprocating humans, but then when we look from an evolutionary psychological perspective, we are fundamentally relational. Humans do not survive, let alone thrive, without relationships. So a lot of the infant science or attachment science really demonstrates how babies out of the get-go need to be relationally attuned to. You think babies don't have much of a conversation or they don't need much attention, but they do. They need to be mirrored. And when we talk about attunement, we may not have a conversation, but if a baby's upset, we might mirror. We might let them know we see them by just bouncing them to the rhythm of their upsetness. Or pat them to soothe them, feed them when we know they're hungry. But there are these reciprocating responses that allow an infant, even at a less conscious level, to know that they are seen and that they matter. And that safety, that holding environment that's created by a caregiver is absolutely essential for the synapses of the brain to connect so that the brain can actually build and grow. And when children don't have that or babies don't have that, their brains actually don't grow and they have very significant cognitive and personality developmental delays.
I think that's fascinating. Can you speak a little bit more about the impact of neglect, really, and not having that one-on-one connection at a young age? And, is there a way to repair that down the road?
That's a beautiful question. Yes, so we know these optimal environments in which a baby needs to be tended to. And this can get very political in terms of how people parent, if the baby's sleeping good, or so we're going to stay away from all those issues because really all people are unique and babies and parents have different needs. An older psychologist named Donald Winnicott has a great phrase that I love. He talked about the good enough mother. And so today we might think of the good enough caregiver, realizing that we can't be there for absolutely every need, gurgle, whim of a baby, but that some frustration is actually really important to development because that's reality. And a baby eventually needs to learn how to self-soothe. But initially, babies really need wraparound care just to be able to physiologically grow. And when they don't, the brain doesn't develop as it should. And that can result in I'll back up and say the field of infant mental health is very nascent, very young. And one of the ways that clinical psychologists or scientists understand infant mental health is through the nervous system. So some babies may be more sensitive to smell or motion or audible sound or being held. And so we can see how infants are doing regulating when they have, I guess, within normalcy reactions to stimulation to the different senses. And so some babies, if they're not cared for sufficiently, the nervous system gets out of whack. So the limbic system could become hypoactive or hyperactive. So those are just all things to consider.
Yeah. So, there seems to be, in modern age, right, we've got a totally different environment than, say, with the brain, sort of the human brain that emerged in the context. So what do you think is one of the most difficult aspects of being a brain and a person growing up in this modern environment that's making it more difficult to flourish or to become your true self as opposed to the environment where we're sort of native to, right?
Yeah. That is a really pressing question. And I think the jury's out But I think this is where evolutionary psychology might offer some perspective. And you may be familiar with Dunbar's number. Robin Dunbar was an anthropologist who looked at different primates and their relational capacity and has projected that onto the human relational capacity, and has observed that humans' capacity for relationality is limited, that we really can hold 5 loved ones near and dear, and that we can actually be close to 15 people that are good friends. And there comes concentric circles, but we somewhat max out at 150 people that we can know, but we might be able to recognize more than that.
Yeah.
So in our modern world, when we are flooded with likes and friends and follows, what is the quality of those relationships and how are those helpful for our social media enterprise or helpful for our developing mind?
And so we kind of neglect those deeper relationships for the superficial ones,
Yes.
or we try to have too many deep relationships and they all
We get
never
burned out
actually,
too, probably.
yeah.
I mean, I think Jesus had 12 disciples. I feel like, okay, that's a good number. Keep it at that. That is absolutely fascinating. And I know there are, different theories that also, I think, reveal a lot about the human brain, and that's the attachment theory. And you also mentioned meaning making in adolescence.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak on that?
Absolutely. And I'd love to go back because I think I left things on a pessimistic note regarding infants if they don't get care, and we have technology and too many relationships. There is hope. That the human brain is, as you know, malleable and plastic.
Right.
It is an extraordinary creation.
Yeah.
And the good news is that deep attunement in that work, those experiences, can really remediate brains. Maybe not 100% in cases of severe neglect, but the brain it continues to grow throughout the lifespan. New synapses are being forged.
Right.
But especially in adolescence, there's a huge period of brain growth. And those are really wonderful moments where parents can step in, caring adults, and I'm going to get to your question, and others can really do that attunement and care for young people. We need that in later life, in our marriages. We need to be seen. We need to be known.
Right.
And we need to know that we matter. And when we experience love, our brain relaxes. We can actually be and become more ourselves in the experience of love. So that is extraordinary news.
Which is thriving.
Which is thriving.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So then with technology, I think if we use technology not to dilute our relationships, but to distill our relationships and those that matter, that can be so effective. And there's different purposes for audiences in getting your important podcast out. But those are deep reciprocal relationships. Yeah. And then sort of meaning making. Really recent science, especially pioneered by Mary Helen Immordino Yang at the Rossier School of Education at USC back in California, is doing really extraordinary work looking at how young people make meaning and how that impacts their brain. We have this default mode network in our brain that tends to go towards, when we're not using it, can go towards anxiety, ruminates, can go towards those things from an evolutionary perspective that we had to be preoccupied with in earlier days. And she has shown that when young people intentionally reflect on abstract beliefs and how their implications for the world, what should they value? What should they do? What should be their goals? When they do that and reflect on the implications more broadly, that actually begins to repurpose the default mode network and lay down sources of meaning in their mind. And why this is relational is that we're finding that kids don't necessarily do that on their own. But when they have a caring adult who can come alongside them and say, Catherine, so you've started this podcast, and what have you enjoyed most about it? Or what have you valued? And how is that helpful for people beyond you?
So is it even just the act of asking questions and giving someone the ability to just ponder and think on it.
Practical relational scaffolding.
Yeah, these deeper questions that aren't yes or no answers, but they got to think through. And like, what am I doing? Why am I feeling the way I'm feeling? Yeah, you could see that with young people in the university. The almost default is no, yes, I don't want to, but you have to pull them to develop that depth of person.
And what's so exciting is that you can take a young person, if they might have grown up with a lot of adversity, not necessarily have a lot of attentive parenting or parents that are working and stressed, to be able to come alongside them and help them co-create this sense of meaning and what is of values and help scaffold those into goals. Mary Helen's work is showing over time that these kids are doing better in school. They are more purposeful, their sense of confidence, but it's extraordinary research.
And so it doesn't necessarily have to come from a parent figure.
No.
Just someone to come alongside them.
Yeah. Who's trustworthy, respected, who has that sense of connection with another.
Yeah. It seems that we get, I think looking at the way we make sense of the world, like 10,000 years ago, you had to be in tune with your environment, else you're not going to survive, right? And now you can just chill. Like, I'm not going to worry right now by
Uber eats my meal. I have to worry
where
about
am I going to
that.
get my next meal? Where am I going to be cold tonight? Or here's a storm coming. We really had to be in tune with our environment. Now we seem to just let that go, and we have all this space cognitively to, like, say, ruminate on whatever the heck we want, and we don't seem to have a filter or guidance of what should I be doing with my mind now that I don't have to worry about where I'm going to eat, where I'm going to sleep as much as we used to. Right?
Exactly. So I would say, like, from a historical perspective, we are really at an interesting threshold where we have not the luxury of thinking about other things, because if we don't become purposeful, because we're not using all that energy to survive and figure out, like, I had to walk in the cold last night to find food. Like, whoa, I was like, I'm from LA. How do I do that? There's snow on the ground. It's 7 to my body, but 10 here and everything's closed. Where am I going? We don't have to think like that often.
Right. Yeah.
But the reality is, if we don't repurpose our brains, if we don't find meaning, if we don't start to pursue purpose, we languish.
Yeah.
That is not thriving. And we need to really repurpose our brains. We need to adapt our thinking to not rely on being driven by fear and anxiety like our brains kind of were originally created for.
Yeah.
We need to repurpose them and have them not driven by fear, but motivated towards purpose and motivated by love.
And that takes work. And it's probably not, is that instinctual for us as humans or kind of counterintuitive?
I'd love to study that. I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah.
I think we are inherently, I know we're going to get into some theological waters of, like, we are wired for goodness. But we also have these propensities to be protected.
Right.
And it's really important, as our environments change, as you're naming, Dan, that we have to recognize how our psychological capacities need to adapt to those environments.
It's a thing about the human brain is that we can reflect upon. We have this unique ability to reflect upon what we're doing and to recognize our evolutionary biases. When you think about, like, the in-group, out-group bias is like being distrustful of people you don't know could be beneficial in a hunter-gatherer society. But now we have the ability to say, okay, well, that's maybe not helpful now.
In a pluralistic democracy, not helpful.
Right? Not maybe. It's not helpful. But we at least have the ability to think about our cognitive states. Why do I have that? Okay, I recognize that bias. Now, what am I going to do about it? Or, like you're saying, I recognize, okay, this is the way I'm comfortable doing things, but why is that? Is there something beyond that? And it takes cognitive work to do that.
Well, and from an evolutionary psychological perspective, that ability to reflect is one of the key distinctions between us and other species.
Right.
And our ability to regulate.
Right.
So we can regulate our emotion, anger management, mindfulness, meditation, prayer, all help us calm down and put us in a space where we're calm enough to reflect and make those connections with, like, how am I fitting with my environment? How is my time spent with technology helping me thrive or not? So that regulation and that reflection are really essential to humans' continued psychological adaptation.
Well, and even continuing on that point, in your book, Thriving with Stone Age Minds, you are combining, evolutionary psychology with a biblical worldview. How do you approach then this complete picture of what it means to be human?
I am a firm believer in a creator of this universe that is beyond my apprehension. But to that, I feel like as a human and one called to continue or to contribute to God's ongoing work in this world, I feel very called to draw on the tools and experiences I've been given. So as a social scientist, as a wannabe theologian, how do I best understand the enterprise of being human? And so for me, again, theology offers that telos, those ideas, those ultimate calls on our life, a vision of a life that can move us forward as humans, one in which we are called to unity in Christ. I'm very influenced by Miroslav Volf's theology of the flourishing of all creation. He's at the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. And so then psychology helps me understand, again, how humans can change or not to participate more fully in God's ongoing work. And so that's where I really love having this descriptive science that really helps us understand transformation and change, and also this, ultimate vision of what life could and should be.
Yeah. We often talk about the limits of science, and it sounds like there are limits to psychology too.
Absolutely.
And what it explains about what it means to be human.
Yeah. So if you're looking at, at the church, for example, or as a minister, like what is it that insights from psychology that you've seen that translate to help you in terms of helping people flourish, right?
Wonderful question.
How's this help you on the ground?
Yeah. So very much. I think just this is personal, but like Romans 12, 1 and 2 have been one of the most compelling verses in my life of like really wanting to offer my life as a living sacrifice, totally and pleasing to God. And so, I, as a young person, turned to the church to know how do I do that? How do I more fully offer my life? How do I become more righteous in Christ? How do I become more generative? How do I be faithful to who Pam is, as different from who you guys are? Yeah. And so, but I don't see the church answering that question. I think in my own personal experience, my youth group did have a lot of extraordinary experiences of service and mission and leadership that allowed me to discover some of my gifts. But I would love to see the church broadly take seriously activating God's people and enabling God's people to call and to thrive. I honestly understand discipleship as an invitation to thrive. And I feel like often, and I can speak from more of my experience in the church, it was all about Jesus. The symbol of Christianity is the cross, not an I. So everything you should do should be about Jesus, not you.
Yeah.
And I took that, but I buried a lot of me. And I think there became almost shame of like, I shouldn't stay out. And so if I excelled and got attention, I felt a lot. I shouldn't have
false humility.
Yeah. A lot of tension about that. And so my work with the Reciprocating Self, and I just love doing this with my students, is like, God made us each unique. We all have strengths and gifts, spiritual gifts, however you want to formulate that. And that's a really important part of our purpose. Is like, how do we cultivate those and be a good steward of them? But they're not for our own ends. We do that with others and for others and for God's purposes.
Yeah.
And so I really try to encourage, hope that the church can find ways that we can worship and exalt God and confess and participate in sacraments, but also have experiences where people are activated and their giftedness is affirmed.
Yeah. It's as a Catholic, it's something that the church is sort of in the 20th century sort of focused on, this universal call for holiness and the personal vocation, right? Because I think that is something that we need to draw out, that everybody in every walk of life has something that they need to do to flourish that nobody else is going to do. And once you recognize, nobody can replace me, or nobody can replace Catherine, nobody can replace Pam, what you have to do, it gives more, there's no way to have a better sense of purpose and meaning because you're irreplaceable in what you're going to do.
I keep thinking back to, so I'm named after St. Catherine of Siena, and her famous quote is, be who you are meant to be and you will set the world ablaze. And I feel like that kind of captures everything you're talking about of You have to find out who is it that you uniquely were designed to be, live in that thrive, and actually, is that thriving, is that holiness?
I think that is when it's done with and for others.
Right.
And I believe with and for is a rather Jesuit phrase. And that's the name of the podcast that I recently started. But, so often in the U.S., in the Western culture, when you say, St. Catherine's beautiful quote, people often take a blaze for myself and my own glory.
Right.
And they forget or don't have the context to think, no, there's a greater glory for this. And when we pursue, happiness, our own life satisfaction, that only lasts so long. It's a dead-end street really quickly. But it is when we are doing that with others and sharing ourselves with others.
And are there psychological benefits to that as well?
Oh, yes. Because you need that love to really be and become yourself. So when you pursue your own ends, your own purpose, outside of sharing it with others or cultivating it with others, you won't be as effective because you really need that love to just unfold as who you are. Otherwise, you have a performance attitude more than a purpose.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of psychology that looks at, the people are more psychologically flourishing if they recognize something beyond themselves, that they're drawn to and recognizing your self-limits, and there's something greater out there than you,
Absolutely.
And even secular psychologists are looking. I say there's a study. I went to UC Berkeley, and there's this eucalyptus trees right outside my window. But these people will stare at these eucalyptus trees, these huge, and do that for 60 seconds, and they just have this sense of connection
And
with something
wonder.
greater, and there's wonder, right? And that's only on a sort of a secular level. You add the wonder of God and realizing you're meant for Him, and that you are. Have
Called
that
to
meaning,
something more.
called to something more.
Yeah.
It helps. We all need that, and if we don't have that, we don't flourish psychologically, spiritually,
Absolutely.
Anyway.
You've already kind of mentioned some names, but you really are pioneering fascinating work, and I'm so grateful for that. Is there someone who inspires you academically, and someone who inspires you from a faith perspective?
Those are so many.
Hi.
An interdisciplinary person who's been on the planet 55 years has had a lot of influences. It's interesting in this conversation, someone that academically is coming to mind, one of my beloved mentors, Rich Lerner, who's a developmental scientist at Tufts University and on the Pontifical Academy of Life with the Vatican, has made huge impressions on me. And Rich is brilliant, but he has an incredible ability to embrace development in the human experience in all its complexity. And so often, like, scientists like to be reductionistic and get to what are the mechanisms or the aspects that are causing change. And Rich he has the capacity to consider an individual's particularity and recognize we might all thrive slightly differently. He can take the complexity of the goodness of fit between an individual and the many systems in which their life is in. And this is so important for developmental science because we have abilities, we have disabilities, we have genetic predispositions, we have different experiences of nurture that cause those genetic predispositions to be expressed differently. And how do we factor all of that in? And Rich also has just such respect for transcendence, for that which is beyond the material realm. And I've appreciated his example that we don't necessarily need to name that transcendence. And now, from someone with a Christian worldview like my own, I can name in my life that the experience of love and grace in Christ enables me to know God the Father through the Spirit in a profound way that those beliefs, just reflecting on them, gives me that experience of awe, that's the emotion of awe and gratitude that someone might have from looking at a eucalyptus tree. So it has so much to do with the meaning we ascribe those situations. And we do know from a research perspective, when people apply more sacred meaning to experiences of transcendence, it has more ordering power on their identity, on their life narrative, on their motivations, and on their behaviors. So sacred narratives are really important for people. And that's where, like, in our world today, there's not a lot out there.
Yeah.
And I really think we need to re-invite people into faith in a way that activates them and gives them life, not dampens them down, which I think has been so many people's wrong experience.
Expression, or experience. Yeah.
And that to experience the goodness, the love, the transcendence that really can enable people to become more.
Just as we're starting to get towards the end here, if you could, maybe just sum up what your reflections on human purpose are in terms of what your life work has been, and how you would, if somebody comes into you and says, Pam, I'm struggling with my faith. What is my purpose, right? Obviously, everybody's unique, but how do you talk to them about that?
Well, I think at a really practical level, and I could get into, if the person is really struggling with their faith, I may not give a biblical or theological answer, but go psychological. I've talked about those. But I think the science of purpose, one of my other great influencers in my life is Bill Damon, and it's hard to think about Rich without Bill. And Bill Damon is, he is at Stanford and is the director of the Center on Adolescence and has absolutely pioneered in the psychology of purpose. And Bill puts a stake in the ground and says that purpose is truly purpose when it's a noble purpose. And so we can, research breaks down that this concept of purpose is effective when people consider purpose as an enduring life goal. So meaning is what's meaningful, but purpose is actionable. So your life goal might be to enable people to know God more fully through science. I'm guessing. I don't know. So you can do that in the classroom, in research, in a podcast. So what is your enduring life goal? And then that goal has to be meaningful to yourself.
Is it almost like your own personal mission statement and having that?
Yes. Okay. And often my students, they're in grad school, so it's voluntary, but their parents might want them there. Or we're Pacific Rim, we have a ton of Asian students who often come with a family purpose and a less differentiated individual purpose. And that can be powerful, but just knowing, am I pursuing purpose, my purpose that's meaningful to me, or is it a purpose that's someone else
put on you?
It's
not really
family expectation, community expectation, congregational expectation, approval. So the actual goal needs to be meaningful itself, but it needs to contribute to the world beyond yourself. And so again, if it's just me-oriented purpose, that's not a true purpose. But when purpose is beyond the self, when it benefits others, then you really reap psychological benefits. And we find that when people pursue purpose in this way, they actually end up connecting with more like-minded people. So if we're talking about a young person, they find mentors or peers that can support them in the journey or wrestle with them in that journey. They become more clear about their priorities, which in a world when we have 500,000 options, knowing your priorities and values is essential. So I think like understanding purpose in that way is really helpful.
For someone who might be there listening to this asking, okay, but how do I find my purpose? I don't even know where to start there. What do you want to say?
This might be a surprising answer, but one of the first ways people can do this is to think about joy. And when they have in their life experience the most profound joy, like real joy, not just a buzz of happiness, just like that was fantastic pizza, but like, no, it was great pizza, but it was because I was with my kids and my teenagers don't always spend a lot of time with me. So that was awesome. So when we think about when we experience joy, what we're doing, the activities, the skills we're using, that usually points us to what we're passionate about. It also points us to the people that we care most about. So when you're thinking about purpose, you want to identify what are my strengths, my passions, when do I feel most alive and joyful, and who are the people that I need in my life that give me joy, and who are the people that give me the most joy to care for and serve. And then how does that align with how I'm trying to become like Christ? Like, we don't want to do this in an crazy way where we're not experiencing balance, but when we're living out the virtues that Christ modeled. So yeah, think about your passions, think about people, think about those virtues and values that define your life.
I'm thinking about it right now. That's great. I've heard that like people use the term like blue flame almost to be like where it's like what you're hitting on, like when do you feel the most yourself and like alive?
Yes.
And we've gotten away from that.
I don't know if you guys have this catechism, but the first question is, what is the chief end of humankind? And the response is to glorify God and enjoy God forever. In the irony, the tomes written on sin in theological libraries are massive, and joy is very thin. So we need to reclaim joy.
I love that. I love that. We're so grateful to have you on our podcast. You have your own podcast, as you mentioned, with and for, which is fascinating. I've been able to listen to a few episodes already, and you're speaking with experts delving into psychological science, but again, spiritual wisdom as well, as we've been doing here today. Anything that you want to let our listeners and viewers know about other projects that you're working on so they can connect with you and, see more of your work?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for asking. Yeah. So new podcast, 3 weeks out with and for. And so the conversations are really dialogues between people who really commit their lives to thriving. And when I talk about thriving, it's thriving for a flourishing world, not just my own personal thriving. So we have psychological perspectives, neuropsychological, some theological. We always have practices. And the hope is to really guide people and offer practical steps that they can do daily to pursue thriving. That is not just spiritually informed or biblically informed, but that is actually psychologically informed. And to accompany that on thethrivecenter.org, we have a host of resources, either audio practices like guided meditations. We have like PDFs you can download to remind you or to journal a lot of reflections.
Yeah.
We, from the research from the last 2.5 decades, have a lot of blogs and insights to unpack like what is purpose, if you didn't quite catch that, or how do people make meaning, or what is moral injury or attachment theory, and what does this have to do with daily life? And lastly, I'll say, recently I created what I call a spiritual health framework. And the reality is not all spirituality is very healthy. A lot of shaming, guilt-driven, probably a lot of spirituality in the Hitler movement. Lots of transcendence there. Not good, not to good ends. So I have used not just my own research, but a lot of my own work and those of others to really graph out and identify 6 facets of healthy spirituality. And if you want to hear more about that, I'll recommend people to the website so we don't have to get technical here. But I hope that's really helpful for leaders in spiritually engaged contexts, whether it's a nonprofit or clergy or like a school ministry or a hospital where you have chaplains of like helping people get in touch with the vast psychological resources for resilience and for thriving.
Yeah, that's great. Because, I think people can listen to this and say, well, I want purpose. I want thriving. I want that in my life. How do I do that? And because you said there's so many ways to go that in the wrong way that are self-defeating. So it's great to have all those resources.
And it's great to have you here, Dr. Pam King. It's obvious you're living out your mission, and we're grateful for that.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to be with you and for greater purposes. So thank you so much.
I think I could have spoken to Pam forever. It was just fascinating, her research. And we've talked about how there's community hardwired into our brain, our need for community. And she seemed to really underline that with her research from, a psychologist's perspective as well.
Yeah, right. We're meant for community, meant for others. And, the interesting thing about how we really need to have those deep relationships with 4 or 5 people, and then have, meaningful relationships with the circles on out of that. But that's part and parcel of what allows us to be the person we're meant to be.
Right. And again, her research when it comes to what it means to thrive, what it means to flourish.
Yeah. When it was interesting when she talked about purpose, and there's this whole expanding field of the psychology of purpose and meaning. And, her point there was that the purpose that you have has to go beyond yourself. And this is something that psychological data seems to show. If my purpose is just to make a lot of money, it's not going to help me flourish psychologically. It's like, my purpose has to be for others and to give my life to others, it resonates perfectly with what we are supposed to be living in the Christian life, So it's really interesting, the synergy between what the science of purpose is showing, that we need this transcendence, something greater than ourselves. And that's exactly what we see and what we've known through our Christian faith for millennia.
Then we're the best version of ourselves, too, when we're giving to others. So fascinating. Grateful to have her on. And that she travels all the way from California. Okay, well, now I have some questions for you, Dan, as we move into the office hour segment of the show. So there was a pretty striking quote from Pope Francis in recent weeks. He spoke out boldly against the practice of surrogacy and surrogates. He called the practice deplorable, said it's a commercialization of pregnancy. He called for a global ban. I think a lot of people were struck by his choice of words there, given its great acceptance in our culture. But I was curious on your thoughts on that as a Catholic biologist.
Yeah, no, I think what he's getting at is a couple things. One, I think that surrogacy has a tendency to treat the woman's body in a utilitarian fashion, that a woman's only useful if she can provide the space for my baby to grow, right? And so there's sort of an economic issue that goes on there. These poor lower class women, underclass women are going to be exploited, so there's certainly that. But there's also sort of this relationality that we've talked about on the show today that begins in the womb, right? And that the placenta is a relational organ, right? It's a half of the baby and half of the mother, and some of the cells cross back and forth to that. So that bond between mother and child is beginning there in utero, and your sort of surrogacy, so disrupts that, right? In a sense. So there's a certain, that relational aspect of us is being altered in a sense with that.
There's ethical concerns, but again, you're speaking to the biological concerns that are there as well.
Yeah.
And to that same point, speaking of that connection of the child and mother in the womb, and then afterwards, the connection with mother and child, there's a recent study when it came to breastfeeding and brain health. Can you speak to those findings? Yeah,
there was interesting studies showing what they looked at was what's called the metabolome in the gut. So they looked at all of the metabolites in the gut of the baby, and they looked at those that were breastfeeding in the first 6 months and those that were taking formula. And there's different metabolites in there, right? So, for example, those that breastfeed had higher amounts of cholesterol, which is very important for brain development and brain health. And so they saw a correlation between metabolites that were there, the higher ones that were there in the breastfeeding, and a increased brain development at the age of 2. So, it's interesting. I mean, breast milk is, and as a mammal in our biology, it's produced something that is going to be very beneficial. There's a lot of research that needs to be done on this that might be able to help, but it's not surprising given that our biology is set up for relationality and for the development of that brain, which is the organ that really allows us to have that relationality.
I think that's totally the point of not making a judgment call on mothers and children who, for whatever reason, can't do breastfeeding, but it speaks to the biology and, again, the importance of that connection between mother and child.
Yeah, exactly. How our biology seems to be designed to get to a certain stage, a certain relationality.
Yeah. Well, fascinating conversation again with Dr. Pam King and with you, Dan, as always. And I want to remind our viewers and listeners that if you have a question, maybe you saw something that you want to get Dan's take on, or just a science question you've been wondering, you can submit that question by emailing us at info@magicenter.com. You can also leave us a voicemail at 949-257-2436. Be sure to go to magicenter.com to see the latest with what we're up to here at Purposeful Lab, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. We'll see you next week.